Good morning. Welcome to Australian Fairy Tales, the podcast. Old stories of travellers across time, messages left like a fossil to be rediscovered and reinvented. This October, the Australian Fairy Tale Society will take a deep dive through time, culture, and language to explore fairy tales from an Australian perspective and discover what flesh they wear today. Through this podcast, you'll meet some of our magical academics, creatives, and performers. In particular today, Lorena Carrington, my guest.
Good morning, how are you?
Good morning. First and foremost, Lorena, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders, past, present, and emerging of the land on which I stand, which is that of the Yuggera and Turrbal people in Brisbane. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which our listeners stand and extend a welcome to you and those of your country.
Thank you. I'm on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in Castlemaine in central Victoria.
Beautiful, beautiful country.
Yeah.
So Lorena is a photographic artist and book illustrator based in regional Victoria. Her publishers are Serenity Press Australia, Kane Miller USA, and would you like to say the name of the Polish publisher?
Do I want to? Wydawnictwo Tadam. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but yes, in Poland.
So those like Swan River Press Ireland, Eagle Books and the Australian Fairy Tales Society have also commissioned her covers. So Lorena exhibits regularly in Australian galleries and her knowledge of illustration, books and story is shared through school and library visits and at literary and arts festivals. Now, Lorena received the 2020 Australia Fairy Tale Society Award for her outstanding contribution to the field of Australian fairy tales and has designed conference artwork for 2 of our festivals, but more on that later. You can certainly find more of Lorena's works at lorenacarrington.com and also at serenitypress.org. So once again, Lorena, welcome.
Thank you.
So please tell me a little bit about your love of story, fairy tales in particular, and how that began.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a photographer for 20-something years and an exhibiting photographer of artworks. And I first started exploring fairy tales when my children were quite young, because I was reading them what we think of as the classic fairy tales, and wanted to find stories that had girls and women having adventures and slaying their own dragons or not slaying dragons, as the case may be. So I was really interested in going back and finding old tales that we don't know so well now. And I was making images around those stories for exhibitions. So I was showing work here in regional Victoria and down in Melbourne at galleries. And I'd already started, I've always had a love of books and illustration. I grew up in a library, so my father collected thousands and thousands of books on history and mythology and philosophy and various things. And my mother was an artist, so there's nothing else I could have done. So in 2016, I was introduced by chance to Kate Forsyth on Twitter. It's the power of social media. And she bought an artwork of mine to celebrate the end of her PhD. And we got talking and ended up talking about what kind of projects we were working on, as you do. And it turns out we were both working on the same project without knowing each other. So she'd been going back and finding these old tales with an idea of retelling them. And I'd been going back and finding tales and illustrating them. And it turned out I'd already made artworks around some of the stories that she'd retold. So again, it had to be. So we worked on in secret on Vasilisa, which was our first book together. And then we put the call out for our publishers, looking for people who might be interested in publishing that kind of book. And we found Serenity Press. And I'm now about to have my 7th or 8th book, I think, out with them. So it's number 4 with Kate. So we've we've done three collections of retellings of fairy tales of brave, kind and wise young women. And we've got one coming out about gentle young men as well this year, one for the boys.
Excellent.
Well, you know, and they're all for everybody, but to remind us all that those stereotypes don't need to, you know, always be there in the tales that we expect them to be, if that makes sense.
So what kind of things have you learnt about fairy tales through doing the research and through doing the illustrations for those books, Lorena?
Well, it's really shown me, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more in relation to the conference of Flesh and Fossil, but they're a malleable thing. Stories change and evolve, and yeah, like everyone, I grew up on the classics, so you know, it felt like they were set in stone. They, you know, you knew the story of Cinderella and you knew the story of Sleeping Beauty, and that was the fairy tale. But they adapt to the cultures that they're in, and they adapt to the people telling them, and the ideas that they want to get across, for better or for worse sometimes. But for me, they really reflect the history and the place that they're being told through, and they're an incredibly important cultural kind of element of you know, of everything, really. They're in all of our lives.
So talk to me a little bit about your process for layering up your photographic images, because they're very rich and it's a very unique style that you have.
Yeah, I very much found a niche, I think, which is helpful. So all of my work is photography. I don't do any drawing. I'll occasionally do some stick figure sketches to begin with, just to get an idea of layout and composition. But apart from that, it's all photography. So I have to photograph every single element, either out in the backyard or on the light box inside, which is a flat white surface, which is lit from underneath, and it means I can get a nice clean white silhouette, black silhouette on white. So I've got tens and tens of thousands of images that I can draw from, and I layer them up using backgrounds of local landscape and and further afield as well, and make creatures out of leaves and sticks and twigs and bits and pieces. Sometimes
creatures and beings.
Yes, it's often like doing the most incredible jigsaw puzzle, but I get to choose where the pieces go.
It is. So we'll come to overseas later, but you've got a very strong relationship with your own landscape and the the leaves and the twigs, etc., that you choose to photograph. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, when I first started working on the illustrations in the style that I am now, again, I had small children. It was harder to sort of travel and venture further afield. So practically speaking, it was easier to go out to my backyard and pick up some leaves and twigs and bring them back inside and photograph. But also, I think the challenge of being restricted in that way kind of makes you see what's there already, and being able to create something new out of stuff that's just lying on the ground outside the back door is quite empowering, I suppose, and inspiring, to be able to use what's around you to make whole other worlds. It's very exciting.
It is. And then you've gone on to do collaborations with Sophie Masson, a French-Australian writer as well, and in particular like her book of French fairy tales, and actually got to go over to France. So So talk to me a little bit about the difference between using, if you will, elements of an Australian
Mm,
landscape to illustrate European tales and being able to actually use elements of a
mm,
European landscape to do
yeah.
the same.
Well, it's been quite interesting because I was always quite proud of the fact that I could make anything out of what was lying outside on the ground. It's like, you need a castle? Done. You need a griffin and a lion? Certainly. Um, I was obviously incredibly thrilled to get the chance to go over to France and photograph the landscape where these stories were set, and quite specifically where she set some of the stories. But I was also slightly nervous as well because I was, it was like making a feast out of, you know, what you've got in the veggie garden and what's left in the freezer, and still being able to come up with, you know, a fantastic meal. And suddenly I had a table full of, you know, caviar and foie gras. I had this plethora of images of actual castles and real European landscapes. And I was actually worried that my work would change and it wouldn't have the same feel to it, because I wasn't having to, you know, desperately scramble for imaginary castles. But actually, of course, it's, you know, it's been fabulous, and I use them every day because I've got, you know, beautiful wobbly windows to stick into my buildings and stone staircases. And I was able to collect, I was still scavenging sticks and leaves and bits and pieces off the ground. So, you know, you can picture me in the grounds of Zay-le-Rideau, which is a beautiful castle on a lake in France, in the drizzling rain, crawling around the grounds with my Ziploc bag, stuffing leaves, getting a few very strange looks from the other tourists. So I scavenged all these, you know, bits and pieces and photographed them back in the hotel room. So I also had, you know, sticks and leaves and bits and pieces from over there that I could then turn into French beasts and bits and pieces.
It's just a really fascinating process. So what kind of images are you inspired by in order to create your works? Are you like an Arthur Rackham girl, or
Oh,
are
absolutely.
there other, or are there other illustrators that you particularly admire?
Absolutely. So yeah, I think it's quite obvious in the use of the silhouette that I'm very much inspired by the golden age of fairy tale illustrations. So yeah, Arthur Rackham's and Virginia Frances Sterrett, and all sorts of people whose name isn't coming off the top of my head on this early Saturday morning. So yeah, there's definitely that that grounding in fairy tale, and I, you know, like I do with the stuff that I make the illustrations out of, I'm a scavenger, so I collect images online. So, you know, it might be well-known, you know, contemporary illustrators, or it might be, you know, people who have got 3 followers on Pinterest who put up something interesting. Yeah, I've got many Pinterest boards of scavenged.
So why particularly silhouettes? Why did they speak to you so strongly of fairy tales?
Well, they're very much a trope, I suppose, in fairy tale illustration, and they were used early on because making books was expensive, and being able to use a silhouette, just a black, nice clean silhouette, means you could print an illustration onto text pages, and you didn't have to spend a fortune on tipping in coloured plates. So you could still have a book with illustrations, but make it affordable for people who may not otherwise be able to, you know, afford incredibly expensive colour plated books. So made it, you know, accessible to more people, and people could buy them for their children. So I think that's really where it sort of started, as a classic fairy tale illustration. And I use them now because I work in photography. If again, for completely practical reasons, if I had a photograph of a person, it would be that person. It's, you know, it's a photograph of my daughter or their friends. But with a silhouette, it could be anybody, and it allows the reader or the viewer to put themselves into the illustration. I think it makes them more accessible and less, you know, a visual story about somebody else. It's it means it could be you in there, I think.
It is wonderful, and certainly that's I guess one of the richnesses of that kind of illustration style for me as well, because you know, you're not so limited as to what are the exact, you know, facial features, etc. You can, the reader can use his or her own imagination when looking at those images. But you know, also fascinatingly, you know, just looking at your images over time, they become more richly and richly layered as well. So, you know, and I think we've spoken before, you know, you started with, I mean, the number of layers that you have in an image is quite incredible now. But, you know, so what was that sort of arc of process for you, like arcing up the challenge level?
Well, I don't like to get bored. So, yeah, like everyone, you want to keep setting yourself creative challenges, and your work has to evolve. It'd be quite sad if you're looking exactly the same as they did when I was working, you know, on the first books. I still love the work I did then, but I also love the fact that, you know, it's changing over time, and I can do a lot more with it. So I think there's a bit more sort of three-dimensionality in a lot of the works. And yes, I have been making illustrations with more and more elements in them. I think my record, I did, well, which book was it? The book that we've got coming out with Sophie soon, some Magical Tales from French Camelot, has got an illustration with 270 separate images in it. So that's kind of a mille fleurs style illustration based on the unicorn tapestries. So I've just filled it with flowers. So I spent.
I'm waiting for that one now.
And then I've just finished working on a picture book with Sophie, which isn't specifically fairy tale related, but the end papers for that, I finished them and realised I had 294, I think, individual images in them. And I thought, that's too close to 300. So I packed in another 6. So I've got exactly 300. Obsessive.
Oh, well, check.
So yeah, they're massive files. So I'll start wondering why my computer's starting to run a bit slow. And the illustration I'm working on is 4 gig in size, just that one file.
Wow.
Things. So yeah, it's about setting myself new challenges, I think, and keeping it interesting for anyone who's seeing them, and for me too.
It's just fabulous seeing your work. So I did want to talk. So I'd like to ask you, can you talk us through when you get a commission, say for the cover of the Australian Fairy Tale Society anthology, South of the Sun? What kind of things are you looking at? What kind of brief are you looking for from the folk?
It depends on what the project is. So if it's a novel, then I'll read through and pull elements out and think about what I want to show and what I don't want to show on the cover. So I try to include sort of up to 2 or 3 obvious things that give a hint of what the story is going to be about. And if I can, I'll sneak in a couple of things that are recognisable later after you've read the story. You can go back and go, ha, that's what that was. But it's a fine balance, because you don't want to pack too much in there. I have also had clients who want to include every single element of their book into the cover illustration, and sort of have to talk them back down a little bit. So you don't want to give it all away. Something with like South of the Sun, which I think I've got down here, which is a collection of a contemporary Australian fairy tales. So they're all very different stories, and it's illustrated by different people as well. So I wanted to try to bring together the idea that it's a collaborative work. There are lots of elements in it, but they all build up into one cohesive body of work. So that's kind of how we ended up with the castle made of sticks. And it's got lots of things happening in it. So it's got a girl chasing a chicken off the roof, off the roof, and there's kangaroos and there's gum leaves. So bringing together lots of elements of the Australian landscape and little elements of stories. And I thought, our House of Sticks was the perfect way to kind of get that across, that building up of lots of different elements.
With all those individual rooms, just giving hints of what's inside.
Yeah, little stories in each one of them.
Yes, and we set you a harder challenge. It was a harder challenge even for us as well. So I guess I'll just step back a tick. So you did the 2016 conference, which was Into the Bush, Its Beauty and Terror. So you used a pre-made illustration?
Yeah, I think at the time it was an illustration I'd already made. From what I remember, it was 8 years ago. No, it wasn't 8 years ago, 6 years ago, I think. But I may have changed a couple of things. I can't remember. But so it's an illustration of Vasilisa stepping out of the forest. And I'd actually made this before I worked on the book with Kate. So again, it was one of those images I'd made as an artwork for exhibitions before working on books. So it's got elements of that European tale, Eastern European tale of the girl with the flaming skull, but she's stepping out of the Australian bush. So yes, it was merging those elements together and bringing those, the idea of the European tale, which is,
so certainly,
landscape.
Into the woods, into the forest, into the bush continues to be an ongoing theme. It really does. But as I was saying, we really set you a challenge with the 2022 conference, which has the theme Australian Fairy Tales, Flesh or Fossil. And while even we as the organisers really love the themes, it's taken us time as well to kind of grapple with different aspects of it, ranging from oracy versus literacy through to the way stories can evolve over time. Quite often in fairy tales, because they are, if you look at the oral ones, certainly just handed down over time, and even a lot of the early literary ones too, they've morphed and changed, and there are different cultural variations. And so in a sense, they can kind of become bare bones, but then they reflesh again, as you go into different cultures or even into your own life experiences. And so you provided us with some lovely suggestions at first. And like the one with the fox and the rabbit chasing each other were lovely, but it just seems so very European, like they're introduced animals in Australia. So we did challenge you to think again. But it was a bit of an interesting dialogue that was happening between. So how was it from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the back and forth. So I think I sent through 3 of those sort of stick figure sketches to start with the caveat saying they will look better than this. I promise. So we had the fox and the rabbit, and I think the first photographic version I worked up. I think we all agreed was just a bit too literal. It was the skeleton. So I had
a dinosaur skeleton with
so it was a skeleton,
a wallaby or a kangaroo, I think.
So it was a can't remember the name of the dinosaur it was based on, but it's basically a giant kangaroo, in prehistoric Australian kangaroo, and that skeleton was made from living things. So it was made from leaves and flowers, and leaves and flowers, basically, a few twigs, underground, and had a wallaby, a silhouette of wallaby above ground, and they were touching noses through that sort of line of surface. So yeah, I'm trying to think of you know, what we think of as being dead and old, but being made of living things, and that contrast in size. And but it's you know, like all good projects, it needed to evolve. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, for us, we're just trying to go like, it's, yes, very literal, but we're trying to go, how does that spark like a fairy tale connection in people's minds?
That's the thing. There was enough of the fairy tale in it, which is yeah.
So for those looking online on YouTube, you can see the actual image that Lorena has created for us behind me here, which are a lovely lady made of stars and the cosmos reaching out to someone underground. The black silhouette above and a white below, very kind of like bone-like, I suppose, in that sense. And then, you know, again, sort of touching hands through the surface. So how did that, I guess, so I know it is an evolving thing. So so how did like sort of like that for you create that magical fairy tale connection?
I was actually slightly nervous about sending that one in, because like the feedback on the skeleton image, I'm sure you're all expecting me to send back something similar with, you know, the skeleton, but sort of a bit more evolved. And I went away and just had this flash of image in my mind of this, and thought, I'm going to be sending them back something completely different to what they're expecting, but I'm going to run with it because I think this is it. So I really wanted to keep that idea of the above ground and underground, and that kind of veil in between. And, you know, you could think of it as the veil between the real and the unreal, and, you know, stories and reality. So I really wanted to keep that. But I had this image of these two figures reaching out to each other, being very similar, but also worlds apart. And have a lot of contrasts in there too. So you've got the black and the white, you know, the dark and the light. You've also got the universal on top, and right down to tiny details underneath. Yet they're still reaching out to each other. Yes, and the underground is made of fossils and rocks and the little curly fossils. Thank you. They're called. And fossilized ferns, and then the very
trilobites and ammonites, one of those, yes.
One of those. Ammonites. Yeah, and then the very sort of fog-like forest above. So there's, you know, quite ephemeral background above and the very solid underneath. So I was thinking about all sorts of things when I was making it, but I'll you know, leave a bit to
beautiful. We now need to create the story that goes with that image.
Yeah. Oh well, if anyone wants to write it, it's
the right way, so people can see that. It's a gorgeous image. Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, I was quite pleased that at how it worked out in the end, and I was very pleased that everyone else was happy too.
Well, we should actually June did, because one of our organisers, June Perkins, is multi-talent herself as well, and she actually has started to create a poem kind of in connection with the theme and in connection with your image. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves in the end. So it'd be lovely to have a performance of that, I think, with that behind us at the festival.
Fantastic. Brilliant.
Oh, so it's beautiful. So thank you very much. So any other thoughts for you? You've done this wonderful image now. So any other thoughts for you around the theme of Australian fairy tales, flesh or fossil? ?
I'm really looking forward to the conference and seeing what thoughts other people are bringing to it. I was thinking about the theme earlier, and again about this idea of that we have of fairy tales, literally being set in stone, like a fossil, and you were talking about that lovely image of it being this skeletal framework that we keep building on. So I think it's so important that we keep talking about fairy tales so that they do keep emerging, evolving and changing and staying relevant to where we are now, because it's important to keep that dialogue going, I think. So I'm really looking forward to the conference and seeing what gets discussed and where it's going from here.
Well, we should look forward to having you up here. And I guess added incentive too, like the Queensland Museum will actually be hosting the Disney animation exhibition as well, right through until January 2023. And it is an exhibition I have seen before down in Melbourne, I think. But again, for lovers of illustrations right through to the golden age, it's definitely worth a visit to see those illustrations. So thank you very much, Lorena, for today's chat.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. So once again, everyone, I'm your podcast host, Shirley Wayne. I've been talking with Lorena Carrington, the illustrator of the 2022 conference artwork, and so much more. And you can certainly visit her work at lorenacarrington.com and at serenitypress.org for the books that she has been illustrating with assorted authors like Kate Forsyth and Sophie Masson. So all fairy tale enthusiasts are welcome to attend a fairy tale ring either online or in their state, and all to attend the Brisbane conference on October 1st and 2nd, 2022. And to learn more, visit AustralianFairyTaleSociety.org for details, and our social media tag is @AustFairyTales. Thank you.